Hey, Through Crosses family, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Pastor AJ. I oversee life groups and discipleship. And today we are continuing our blurred lines section of the series. We are in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 16, talking about traditional gender roles and head coverings. And so we have an exciting conversation in store for you. So with that, let's go deeper. Well, joining us to talk about 1 Corinthians 11 and traditional gender roles, Pastor Danny. Pastor Danny, here we go again.
This is going to be a really great conversation.
We've done a lot of texts in this podcast. We did Revelation, but I don't know if I've been more excited or anxious about a text than 1 Corinthians 11. But we've been looking forward to this one for this entire series.
And our research department has been on high alert. I know we have both read lots of pages and watched lots of hours and wrestled with lots of people around this context. How do we apply this to our lives? And they're a really powerful passage. I'm excited to talk about it just because the passage is so powerful.
Yeah. So we have a lot to talk about, a lot of details, a lot of things going on. So let's jump right in. It begins 11 verse 1. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize, and he talks about something he wants us to realize, but I want to stop there and talk about what Paul is praising them for, which is very unique to the Corinthian church. Up to this point, we've seen a lot of corrections, and here we have Paul praising the Corinthians. And he's praising them for remembering him in everything and for holding on to traditions. Now, I looked in Paul's writings elsewhere and see how Paul handles traditions. Sometimes he's very pro-traditions. He talks about in 2 Thessalonians a lot, hey, stand firm and hold to the traditions that were taught to us, either spoken word or by our letter. Hey, for everything outside of the tradition, not in accordance with the tradition that you received from us, those are things you should be weary about. And yet he's also anti-tradition in certain places. Colossians 2:8, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition. And so I bring this tradition conversation up because, man, this passage in general, there have been so many people trying to figure out what to exactly do with it. So I'm thinking of all the different theories. Hey, this is specific to the context of Corinthians. It's a specific instruction for a specific people in a specific place. Or, hey, this isn't even in the Bible at all, so we don't have to deal with it. This is another rebuttal. We've seen rebuttals going on, like, hey, in the Corinthian church, you've said this, but now I'm saying this. And some people will just say, hey, this is timeless. This is for every church and every generation. And so even before we jump into the meaty section of things going on, what are some biblical interpretation, hermeneutical practices that we can arm ourselves with even before we jump in? How would you advise us to approach this text?
I love how you brought up the concept of traditions in Paul's language, because on one hand, biblical traditions seem like something that the church kind of acquires like antiques or relics over hundreds or thousands of years. Like, that's just a tradition of the church. We don't even know why we still do that. That was from 1,000 years ago. And yet, in this passage, the church is not very old. And so the church already has these traditions that they are actually trying to hold on to intentionally. That's, for anyone who's like, oh, this is just a tradition. It's like, well, then don't miss verse 2 where he says, thank you for holding on to the traditions. I passed them down to you intentionally. On the other hand, like you say, he talks about traditions that we should reject, and these ones connect with hollow and empty philosophy, that there are traditions that we bring into the church like baggage almost from the world. Like it's just a worldly tradition, and we try to fuse it with our faith. And when we do that, we pervert the beauty of the Christian community of the gospel. And what's fascinating to me is in this passage that we'll study today, that's exactly what's happening, is that there are these concepts, this head covering concepts, the male-female concept we'll talk about. These are concepts that are connected in so many ways with traditions in the world outside the doors of the church. And so Paul is writing this letter to say, okay, here's how we as a Christian community in this era have dealt with the overlapping between the world's traditions, the theology that comes from the gospel as a new movement called Christianity, And so here's the new tradition that we've held to try to honor the Lord as he and his work overlaps with the work outside the doors of the church and culture. And so in the same way that he rejects the hollow and empty traditions of the world, he's almost saying, so instead we've built our own traditions in the church that we use to embody what is beautiful about the gospel. And so in terms of the principles of how do we read this passage, I think it's tempting to say, oh, it's just for Corinth, it's not for us, or it's binding for us and Corinth. We talked about that on Sunday. I do think the most helpful way to look at it is not even somewhere in the middle, but to say, you know what? This might be for us today, but in order for us to understand what it means for us today, the first thing we need to do is look at what did this mean for the people of Corinth in the first century. And there's a chance that as we do that work, which is the work we did in the sermon on Sunday, that as we do that work, we're going to either say, wow, this actually is a tradition that we still need to abide by because this is totally evergreen, or we might do that hard work and say, actually, we don't need to take off our hats in church anymore for guys or put on hats to go to Easter Sunday and pray in the service if we're women. But there are some principles that Paul used to build this tradition that are so beautiful. We got to hold on to these principles and build some new traditions that honor the beauty of the theology of the gospel in the local church. And so that's, I'm guessing, where the conversation will go today is which of these are worldly traditions to be rejected, which of these are traditions for Corinth, and which of these can help us create traditions for our church in this place and this time, because we do live in a very distinct place in time in human history as well.
Yeah, as I'm thinking of our conversations in the past about the Corinthian church in general, I'm thinking of all the conversations we've had around philosophy. And anytime you enter philosophy into the conversation, you begin to ask the questions why. Like, why does something exist? Why did Paul even have this tradition? And so that's what we're going to explore. We're going to break this conversation down into the why, the what, and we're going to talk a little bit about the what because there's a little special announcement going on.
Oh, okay.
And the how. So the why, the what, and the how. And I think Paul starts off with the why in verse 3. So he says, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Well, welcome to the controversial part.
Here we are. We're just diving right in.
We're just right there. And the reason I say it's a controversy, I think head brings about some feelings, right? When you hear head, traditionally in our English language, you think of somebody that's the head of a department, the head of some organization. And I feel like whenever you enter into this realm of authority discussion, you automatically think of the abuse of that authority. And so that's what I think is maybe happening with this headship language. And yet this is a word that's not unfamiliar to the biblical text. So I'm going to read a couple of passages that talk about headship. First one comes from Colossians 1. It says, Jesus is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might save or have the supremacy. Ephesians 4 is another one where it talks about spiritual giftings. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. So again, it seems like Paul is using this headship language of Jesus. And again, in Ephesians 1, and he, God, put all things under Jesus' feet and gave him as head over all things to the church. The fourth one here, you might be familiar with it if you're married, Ephesians 5. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. So I read all these things because I think this is a passage that many people and theologians and biblical interpreters have wrestled with. What do we mean when we talk about headship? Is there a sense of this authority that we kind of instinctually have in the English language? Is it something else? What does headship mean?
Yeah, this is one, you mentioned philosophy earlier. This is one that comes from natural law Greek philosophy. So the Greek philosophers are really connected with Corinth, especially in this city where these sophists are coming and preaching all the time about these different worldviews and things. And so this idea of headship in the world was something, right? If Paul said, just so you know, the man is the head of the woman, that is not a controversial statement in first century Corinth. In the Greek and Roman worlds, they believed that the man was the head of the woman, and they meant that in some natural ways and in some bad ways, in the same way that we kind of talk a little bit about that, right? So in the Greek and Roman world, men lived in domination over women most of the time. Women were commodified much of the time. There was this idea of like authoritarianism. There is all of this garbage that headship turned into that comes from this place, and this is in other places in the Bible that talk about men are stronger than women, so it's easy for them to dominate them, subjugate them, abuse them, all the terrible things that men can do through the lens of saying, well, I'm the head, so I'm going to bash you or I'm going to hurt you, right? There's so much perversion that can happen in society. And so it's interesting when Paul talks about headship, he goes back to this natural law concept that kind of like this, well, everyone knows about male headship. And so headship in a non-toxic way is really merely just this concept that men and women are different. And part of, when we talk about man as head, part of the role of man when it comes to society and his relation to society, or the role of man when it comes to a marriage relationship, is that the man in some way, we see some of the concepts in this passage, is the person who is entrusted with protecting, caring for, creating safe spaces for the women that God has provided for him, right? So in a very healthy way in the Roman world, the men were the ones who were sent out to battle, not merely because they were physically stronger, but because people believed, well, it's the men's job to secure the boundaries of this place and create a safe place for the men and women of this civilization to live, right? Or in a marriage relationship, it's the man's job to stand up in that world, and probably in today's world, stand up and fight intruders, stand up and stand up for what is right for their family, protect his wife, his kids. Like part of that is a part of biology and nature. The man is more physically suited much of the time to do so based on biological differences between men and women. But we see this idea that male headship in a philosophical sense is more neutral, where it's natural law would say that men tend to be externally focused, looking outward on the horizon, wanting to protect and scan, like a police officer kind of looking around to keep the city safe. Women are more internally focused according to philosophy and natural law, more in tune with their own bodies, with the community, wanting to bring nurture and protection to the society. And so anyway, I'm not saying that's the explicit Christian teaching on headship, but this is the natural law framework that culture perverts nature by going into male domination and subjugation. And what we say is that grace does not abolish human nature. Grace perfects nature. And so one of the things that we see as we look at the scriptures is that Paul takes this natural, almost neutral concept of male headship, just like in the animal kingdom, there's a differentiation between the sexes. It could be different from species to species, but there's always seems to be a role that men play, or I guess the male species play, a female species play. The same as with the human species. It's natural. And yet when the grace of God appears, the grace of God perfects nature. And so instead of perverting that towards subjugation and domination, Paul says, let's talk about how to tend this natural proclivity that men and women bring to the table in a marriage relationship, like in Ephesians, or in a church relationship, like here in 1 Corinthians, other places, to really draw out what is beautiful about the sexes and not move down a pathway most of the time towards female subjugation, because men tend to be the stronger of the sexes. And so we see that here, where like in that marriage passage, it seems controversial. The controversial thing is that Paul is actually talking about the equality, mutual submission, and the care that a husband is supposed to show even to his wife, right? When he says a husband is the head of the wife, he doesn't say period, or everyone would say, why are you telling us that? Everyone knows that. He says, let me tell you what kind of head the husband is. The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. And you're like, oh, it's leader? It's like, no, it's savior. So just as Christ laid down his life for the church, husbands, you too lay down your life for your wives. And so this idea that husbands, you are the one who is stronger. You are the one who's looking out on the horizon. You are the one who is entrusted to creating a safe place for your family. You are the Jesus in this analogy, so use your manhood like Jesus did to lay down your own life if necessary for the flourishing of your family. That's a left turn or a right turn, however you want to say it, from a toxic headship, and moves into this gospel-infused, beautiful headship. So much of what Paul is teaching is controversial, but it's controversial because what they're doing is they're raising up the flourishing and authority of women within society. They're giving men a charge to be able to look at their wives, right? Like, so Peter says, husbands, love your wives. Tell me if this is not Peter. And treat them with respect as the weaker vessel, and with heirs with you in the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. And it says, okay, so you look at your wife, you're a stronger person. Look at her like she's a porcelain vase, a weaker vessel. You can either use your strength to dominate and smash your wife, or you can do what God would require you to do and treat her with respect like a weaker vessel and as heirs with you in the gift of life so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Peter says, if you don't learn how to treat your wife with respect and keep your hands off of her in a violent way and treat her with dignity that she deserves as an heir with you in life, God's not listening when you pray to him because Christian men treat their wives with dignity. That's what headship looks like. So I think what we see in this passage and others is that God is raising up this idea and going hard after the men to say, you're a man. God has made you biologically stronger. There's things that come with natural headship. Now let's see what the gospel infuses into that headship, because instead of being like the world and dominating over and subjugating women, you're going to be someone who treats them with kindness and respect and dignity, who lays down your life, and you're going to create a place where you and your family can flourish in this home, right? And that's just talking about men. But that's most of the time societies err on the side of perverting what it looks like to be a man in male headship. And so as a result, a lot of times societies like ours just throw the whole concept away. And so it's like, well, men and women are absolutely the same in all things. And then that creates this weird dynamic too, where it's like we'll talk about in this passage, that men and women are different and they have different needs. And in society, there are still distinctions, even in a progressive society, so that, we've talked about this before, but if you go to work at Meta, or you go to work somewhere in a progressive workspace in the Bay Area today, and you're a man in a progressive workplace, and you ask, hey, what's the role of me as a man in the workplace? You might hear HR, or you might hear your boss say, well, your job in this progressive society is to create safe spaces for women to flourish, to provide a seat at the table, right? That's male headship, is use the authority that's been given to you to create spaces where women can flourish with men in safety. And so if we read through the Bible through this lens, and we don't have to go on this tangent because we will for a long time if we don't stop it. If we look through the whole Bible with this lens, we see this everywhere. We see this picture of even Proverbs 31, the elders at the city gate creating a safe space where the women, and I'm assuming men of society, are coming out of the woodwork and doing everything. They're buying and selling real estate. They're living out lives of fruitful agriculture and commerce. Like, it's just such a beautiful city where the men are guarding its gates, but that gives safety and freedom for the women and men of the city to come out and live the fullness of all the gifts of the Spirit in our context within the confines of that city. And so this is the gospel infusion to the natural law of male headship, which is this concept that men in some way are preeminent. We'll talk about that in this passage with this idea of women being created from men. There's this source idea that women are created from men in this passage, but also this is the interdependence but also men are created from women. They literally give birth to men. So Paul actually hits those exact points in a few verses we'll talk about. But so this idea of taking headship and making it align with the gospel is, let's make the male-female relationship look less like the traditions of the world, and let's pattern it around the healthiest interdependent relationship in the world, the relationship that Christ has with his body, the church.
I think this is an important question to start off with, because I think there's a word that you sprinkled in there that traditional interpretations have elaborated on, and it's authority. And I think a lot of people come out thinking like, men have authority, and it feels like authority is kind of one of those words again, like head. It's kind of like, well, as soon as you open the door to authority, you think of the abuse of authority. And so, you could walk through Genesis and look at all the different ways that Adam, was made first. He named Eve. He was given the command. He was approached by God when Eve ate the fruit, and Adam wasn't there to communicate with her. I love this quote from John Chrysostom, though. At the very end, he says, "Let us rule the women," which might sound like, whoa, that's a little much. "Let us surpass them." Okay, what's going on here? "Not by seeking greater honor from them, but by their being more benefited by us."
Yep.
So it's like authority for what purpose? And I think that's what you're kind of saying.
So, I mean, I love that quote that you brought up, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. Is like the reason he's using that language that seems inflammatory is because he's starting with this natural law of like, everyone in the world at his time was like, men need to rule over women and have authority. He's like, okay, hey, let me just say I'm not even disagreeing with you, but let me tell you then how men should rule, because you can rule wrongly.
Correct.
But if we're going to rule right, where I think of that of 1 Peter again, where he talks about husband and wife relationship, he does the same thing where he says, love your wives, washing them with the water of the word to make them holy, to present her to Christ as a radiant bride. This kind of idea of yeah, sure, you've got this authority, you've got this power, like naturally, you can use it for anything. You use it in subjugation. Let me tell you instead, to use any power, any authority, anything that you have naturally or that God has given you as a man to lay down your life to see that your wife is ready to meet Jesus someday. Does not mean it's the husband's responsibility for his wife's Christian faith. It's the wife's responsibility for Christian faith. But it's the idea of, let's start with what culture believes and say, you know what? Let's talk about doing this an alternate way. Instead of using the power that you might have over your wife politically or the power you might have over her physically or all of these different things, let's use any power that you have, like Christ used all the power he had to lay down his life so that we might be one for the gospel. Live out power like that if you have it.
Seems like the question is it going to be a Genesis 3 type of rule where like there's enmity and there's this clash of men and women, or is it going to be like that gospel-infused one? And I'm wondering, just before we move on from this passage, that last line, the head of Christ is God. How might that help inform the conversation that we were
I'll give you this is just for free, a Bible study tip, is that if you're working a theory in the scriptures, and this is not for you, this is for our listeners, but if you're working a theory in the scriptures, like, okay, I think this is what it means, it has to consistently work throughout the passage at the very least that you're working through, right? And so that's one, people preach this passage and say, oh, well, that means that the husband is in charge and he's more important than, or fill in the blank. It's like, okay, let's work that through this whole sentence. So in the same way that Christ is more important than the man, absolutely. The man is more important than the woman, absolutely. In the same way that God is more important than Jesus.
Wait a second.
I'm going to go like, that is heresy if I said that. Like, so right. It can't mean that. What can it mean? In what way is the Father the head of Christ? And then we go back to this Trinitarian relationship where there's some level of primacy of the Father in the Godhead, where Jesus is saying, hey, I just am trying to bring glory to the Father. Or the Spirit says, I just reveal the work of the Son to bring glory to the Father. There's something about that, but in no way is Jesus a second-class citizen of the Father, less power from the Father, less dignity than the Father, right? Even the Spirit is used, the word helper for the Spirit is the same word used for the woman in Genesis chapter 2. So this Trinitarian relationship is by no means is talking about equality, but there's some level of differentiating roles within the Godhead, the Trinity, even to the point where we can say that the Father is the head of the Son. And so obviously, like, theologians have wrestled with that for thousands of years, but we can't deviate from what that means theologically. But what we can do is then we can apply, okay, well, what does that mean if in the same way that a wife is, or a husband is the head of the wife in the same way that the Father is the head of the Son? Well, it can't mean they're not equal. It can't mean one's more important. It can't mean one has more authority. They're in harmony in all things. It has to mean something else. It has to mean something that's as life-giving and beautiful as the Trinitarian relationship. And that's where the most mind-blowing thing in this passage actually is the fact that God relates us to Jesus in the way that Jesus is related to the Father. Yeah. That we are not equal with God. But somehow he's grafted us in to this relationship where we'll see in chapter 12, Christ is the head and we are the body. And so in a sense, if the husband is the head and the wife is the body, that's a beautiful thing. It's crazy to think that God has given us that level of dignity with him and Jesus. And so what does that look like, right? And so it's got to, whatever we decide has to fit the whole sentence. We can't stop before the last word or we've missed the point.
Yeah, I think it undergirds that tension of like, if we go too far to distinction, we miss like Christ and God being the same. But if we go too far the same, we miss Christ and God the Father being different. So it kind of introduces us to these two, bowling alley rails that we have to stay between. So,
which honestly, if you've ever studied the Trinity and you're listening, that's how you study the Trinity. There's no good example for the Trinity, and you can send me the email with your 1.1, but there's no good example for the Trinity. Everyone goes off the rail in some way, but we need the whole community of examples to figure out what it's not so that we can see what it is somehow in the negative space in the middle.
And we decided to spend a lot of time on this because it is the philosophy that's going to inform the rest of the passage. And so we said we're breaking this down in the why. There's the why. We're going to talk about the what and the how now. And that comes in verse 4 and 5. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. So we said we're going to talk about the what. And the what question here is about what exactly is happening in the congregation. And you might be thinking out there, okay, what are women doing praying and prophesying in general? Because it might contradict some other passages. And this is where we are going to throw it to another episode that we are preparing on our end. That's the big surprise. We are going to make a separate episode completely dedicated to the question of what are the roles of women in ministry. And so very briefly about praying and prophesying, is there anything that we should know in terms of the question about how this is being done? Because where I want to lead this conversation and where we want to stay focused is this head covering issue. How do these actions relate to what's going on?
Yeah, so the very quick gender piece in this is, yes, as Christianity, as a evolving movement out of the Jewish tradition, it would be very controversial, revolutionary to see that women are invited into, in our context, like the platform in their worship services, praying to God out loud in front of the men and women alike in the worship services, speaking on behalf of God, prophesying in the midst of their worship services. It's not out of bounds for the New Testament. This is what we see, right? Jesus elevated women more than any other figure in his time. As we study that, we look into even when Jesus is first born, he's met by Anna and Simeon, these two people who prophesy over him, man and woman alike. We see as the church is formed, all of these women are sent out to do ministry. We have house churches led by women. We've got a woman named Junia who's labeled an apostle, right? Not like one of the 12 disciples, but a sent like missionary out in the gospel. We see that the Christianity as a movement so often begins with women in cities and spreads. And so Christianity was a movement very different than Judaism at the time, where in Judaism, the only time that women would be allowed in worship services would be if there were no men. And if you look at kind of the temple architecture, those types of things, there's a court of women, so they can kind of stand off on the side and watch what's happening. But it was a very male expressed worship service. And so wow,
there's your controversy.
Controversy
right there.
is that like we've got men and women alike. Like he doesn't caveat that. It's parallel lines in the Greek language. When the men stand up to pray or prophesy, do it this way. When the women stand up to pray or prophesy, do it that way. And so to understand what it means, and I would say the same thing of this is what we'll probably do in the next podcast too. 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy 2, 3, 4, Titus, is we have to first, like I said before, study these passages in their context. And so we see throughout the New Testament and in this passage, men and women alike standing on the platform, speaking for God over a mixed congregation and speaking to God on behalf of the congregation. And so that is a revolutionary thing. It's a controversial thing.
And so there's the what. That's a little preview to go and check out that episode when it releases. But let's talk about the how, because he's really focused on this thing about head coverings.
Right.
And so we look at the Greek word katakaluptos, and there's just a lot of debate about what this is. Is it just talking about hair? Is it actual cloth covering? So you said at the beginning, a lot of the research department has come out with this.
We've done
passage.
a lot of research on this.
The $1 million question: what is being communicated in the first century with this idea of head coverings?
Yeah, and if you missed the sermon on Sunday, you can go back and listen. That's what we spent the bulk of our time walking through. But just as a real brief version of that, there's a number of uses of head coverings in ancient Corinth in the first century. And so, I will say, some of you, I didn't talk about this on Sunday, some of you have heard, if you've studied this passage before or heard it preached before, kind of this idea of like temple prostitutes in Corinth who would shave their heads. There's actually no historical evidence for that. That was an interpolation that scholars started to guess at because it kind of made the passage make sense, but no one has ever found any historical evidence to that. Right. And so what we're going to talk about today is where the historical evidence leads us and how the early church understood it. And so historically in Corinth, most likely the easiest way to map on what's happening here in this text with Corinthian society is that in pagan worship services, there's tons of gods and temples all over Corinth, Athens, all over Greece. In those services, there would be moments where prayer or prophecy would happen. You would go and stand up and bring a prayer request to this deity or this idol or this demon, or prophecy was a little bit bonkers. This is kind of gross, but they would like cut open animals and they'd read the entrails of the animals like tea leaves and then speak like an oracle from the gods from what they're reading on the guts of the animal on the floor. Like they'd bring a prophecy. And when people would do that, men and women alike, I think mostly men, but we're not sure, when when men and women would do that, they would cover their heads as they would pray and prophesy in these pagan temples as a symbol of submission, a symbol almost of invisibility and humility. This kind of idea of like, I'm not speaking, the gods are speaking through me as an oracle, or God, please don't kill me. You get this picture of just lying like on the ground before God with your head covered. The men would take like a part of their toga and they just like lift it up over their heads. Like toga's like a big long gown. They'd put it over their heads, and it's almost like this with fear and trembling. God, I'm going to speak to you in this place. And so it's interesting when you see Paul saying, men, you don't have to do that here. On one hand, it's controversial. Like, whoa, is there no respect in this place? On the other hand, Paul's making a statement. We're not like the pagan temples. We're different. We're a different kind of religion. So, okay, that's kind of cool. But then at a deeper level, like, you don't need to tremble before you stand before God in this place, right? And this is a theme that comes out in the scriptures, right? In Hebrews, we can approach the throne of grace with confidence because we have a great high priest who's gone through the heavens and is set down on the right hand of the throne of God. We can bring our prayers with confidence. We don't need to be fear and trembling. Even in the scriptures, see this idea that if anyone speaks in the worship services, right, like this, he should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. This idea that you don't have to cower in fear. You don't have to be a mere oracle where it's like you are a part of the body of Christ. We'll read that in the next chapter, and you can boldly proclaim the truth. This is a place that God has given us dignity to approach his throne, and God has given us dignity and authority even to proclaim his truth boldly upon the congregation. This is this challenge to preach the word, and you can preach it without cowering in fear. You are safe in Jesus Christ, right? And so in terms of headship, Christ has created a safe place where you can come and boldly speak. You are safe here.
Yeah.
You don't need to be worried. You don't have to worry about invaders coming or the demons getting you. Like, Christ has secured the boundaries of this safe place. This is your spiritual home. You can take off your hat and you can boldly proclaim the truth under his headship in this place. And so it's a beautiful, powerful statement.
And so that's for men. I'll add a quote from Plutarch, who is a Greek philosopher in the first century. He says, "Why do Romans cover their heads when they worship the gods?" So it's not just Pastor Danny's strange opinion. It's Plutarch.
This is the
Plutarch is coming in here. But if they happen to be wearing the toga over their head, which is the traditional garb, when they meet someone worthy of honor, they uncover. So it seems like there is something about communication of what you were saying and communication of honor. That's another word that gets thrown into the text here, like dishonors his head, dishonors her head. And so if that's for men, what does it mean for women?
Yeah, so that's, this other layer of, two things. One, we've talked about this idea of how does natural law and headship work within the community of faith. And so part of this is, okay, it is absolutely true that Christ has created the boundaries of this place. He's made it a safe place for the men and women to stand up and proclaim his truth. We're inviting men and women onto the platform in first century Corinth. That's beautiful. And then second, though, there's also this second dynamic, like we see in the passage, of this marriage relationship between men and women in the church, where they have these husbands and wives, where on one hand, the husbands are also responsible for creating a safe space for their wife to flourish, right? And so obviously men and women alike are safe within the boundaries of the church of Jesus Christ, whether you're married or single. But part of the wrestling match in Corinthians, seen here in chapter 14 specifically with men and women in the marriage relationship, is the idea of how does the idea of the marriage relationship come into play when you're taking part even as equals under the headship of Christ in the church worship service. And so I mentioned, men use these togas to cover their heads because they didn't have a hat in their back pocket or whatever. Women most likely did not use their togas to cover their heads because in Corinthian society, women would actually wear head coverings a lot of the time. And so there's a fashion aspect of this where, connected to this headship idea, there's this idea that a woman is safe in her home where the husband has created boundaries where she and he and the children can flourish. And yet when a woman would leave the home, is a very vulnerable thing. And so part of the symbol of head coverings in society, philosophers would talk about it as almost like a reminder, an extension of your home away from home, that like, hey, I am still safe, even though I'm leaving the confines of the boundaries where I'm safe with my children and husband, which is interesting. We don't really think about those types of things. Head coverings for women in ancient Corinth was a sign of dignity and honor and modesty. This idea that most women who wore head coverings most of the time in society were the upper and upper middle class women. It was a sign of high esteem, that this is a woman who is dignified. She carries herself with the utmost respect. And that was just part of the fashion of Corinth. And one of the ways that it would indicate that that I am a woman of high esteem in society. And it's interesting, they didn't actually wear their head coverings all the time. A lot of times they'd fall off their heads. And so as part of the hairstyles comes into this passage too. Like in Corinth, women's hair was generally kept up in society, almost like, hey, if my, what's it called? A pala?
Yeah,
If
Paula.
my pala falls off, my hair is still up. Like I am still a dignified woman. This is just part, right? Every culture has its own fashion norms. And these were some fashion norms of that culture that somehow linked with honor, dignity, respectfulness as a woman, and even safety. And in the same way, it seems kind of silly. We're talking about like carrying a symbol of your home wherever you go. But it's kind of funny. You talk to, I've talked to a few women who go out for dinner, like with their friends or whatever, and they forget to wear their wedding ring. And one of the things that I've heard women say in those contexts is, man, I felt so vulnerable out there without my wedding ring on, and there is something to that like this symbol of marriage, right? It's not an overt symbol that like, I'm owned by my husband or anything weird and archaic. But even for us in a society that, people who are reasonable in society, it's like, there's something to like, we feel more vulnerable. I feel more vulnerable when I go outside without this, more like people are going to think that I'm up to no good. I don't think my wife might think think she's up to no good. It just feels like I'm vulnerable to people coming and talking to me, or, like I just feel safer when I'm indicating that I'm in relationship in society. Right. And so it's not a dominating tool, but there is something about the fashion and culture that builds on nature that this is what would be controversial. If Paul said, okay, women, same thing for you, take off the head coverings, he's not saying the same thing as he would be to the men. Like, I mean, he could be saying, because you can boldly proclaim the word of God in this place too. Like, that's awesome. But the head covering represented more than that. So it's also saying, hey, we're going to dial down your dignity a little bit. We're going to dial down your honor a little bit. We're going to make you feel uncomfortable because you're going to feel a little less modest in this place. You're going to feel a little more vulnerable in this place. And so if head covering is the symbol of dignity, honor, and even safety in a world of potential vulnerability, it's interesting thinking about inviting women up to the platform. It feels like keeping the head coverings on in that society, I'm guessing would feel like, hey, you might feel vulnerable standing up, especially with a Jewish religious background, standing up before a bunch of men and women and proclaiming to God. You are safe to do this. Like, this is a vulnerable situation. You bring the household of God with you, or you bring your family with you. Like, you're not alone, right? We're with you as you go up onto this platform. And so, it's seems silly to us because head coverings aren't a part of society. But I'm sure there are, I didn't think of any, that'd probably be weird if I did, but there are like fashion differences between men and women in our society that if we just applied them equally, the men would be like, sweet, sounds good. And the women would be like, I don't know, I don't feel comfortable. Like, I just feel weird stepping in onto the platform looking like that, I have to wear a suit and tie to preach. Like, women don't wear suits and ties. It feels like I'm trying to be a man, And so part of it is, like I said, trying to wrestle with the traditions and cultures outside the walls of the church. And I think, too, we could talk to some of our female ministry leaders around this. I have heard, as we've had conversations offline about these things, that just conversations about what it feels like to be a woman stepping into a pulpit or be a woman stepping into a public prayer service. And it feels like you're carrying a different kind of weight. And I don't know what that weight is like, but that's what I've heard from women that I've talked to. And I do think Paul is just dignifying that men and women are different. And for men, we want to give you the ability to step up here and proclaim the truth boldly. Women, we want you to do that too. And we want you to know that you're safe in this place and you're a woman of honor and dignity and respectability. And you bring the covering of your community with you as you come into this place. You are safe. And I think we get, as we move to chapter 14, and we're still married when we go to church. We're not just like a community of disembodied believers. We still are in this mystery of like, we're in marriage relationships within the church as we are all married to Jesus in that analogy together. So part of it's trying to live in all of these analogies consistently. Yeah. And I think this is why Paul's like, I think I really like this tradition that I've created, because I think it walks the line of all the complexities and beauty of the Christian faith and invites men and women alike into the dignified work of proclaiming the gospel and bringing requests to God, but in a way that doesn't diminish their womanhood or diminish their manhood, but actually accentuates it and glorifies it in some way.
So a couple thoughts. I'm totally indebted to a YouTuber named Mike Winger on a lot of these topics, because...
How many hours of Mike Winger content did you listen to?
So it was 6 hours and 45 minutes of him just talking about all these things. So if you want to look deeper, going deeper, he is the true research department.
And the nice thing about that, because I did not spend 6 hours and 45 minutes, but I walked through Winger's content too. The nice thing about what he does is, kind of like we're talking about, he walks through all of the evidence, and then kind of, and so we get to walk through all that same evidence. But okay, so where are we landing? So we get to land somewhere. So here we are.
So the question that is percolating in my mind as you're talking is, okay, why wouldn't she want to come with a head covering? And I think Mike Winger's stuff is really helpful here. First of all, because he gives us a quote to affirm the modesty symbol. Philo of Alexandria, he's a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher in the first century. He's talking about some sort of judgment process, and he claims that the head covering is, quote, a symbol of modesty. And so right there you have it. But he also goes through ancient artifacts. And so he talks about Livia, who was the wife of Caesar Augustus, who ruled up until about 14 AD, around that time. And it shows her in some contexts wearing no veil, in some contexts wearing a veil. And so it's quite interesting because that's juxtaposed with the image of a commoner, and most of the commoners always have head coverings on. And so his theory is maybe it's like a class thing. And so you think, okay, what would be a reason why a woman would not want to wear her head covering? And maybe it's having something to do with like, hey, I'm pushing the boundaries, or hey, I feel like there's something in there that I'm still wrestling with of why, if it's all those things that you mentioned, why would a woman not want to bring it up?
Yeah, I'm thinking of like if a head covering is a commoner thing, and the freedom to not wear one could be an aristocracy thing. Yeah, it's like a woman stepping up into the pulpit with a tiara on or something, and you're like, well, what are you trying to?
Yeah, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to communicate?
Why are you doing this? Like, no, hey, and I love. There's that vision of like, hey, we are all humble people. Like, he's not giving the men like full reign to be like braggadocious. Like, he's reminding them like, you're under the headship of Christ in this place, but hey, step into this space. Yeah. And so I like that.
And I know one of the other theories too is like maybe there was like a sexual connotation where it's like, hey, keep the head covering on because like we don't want men to lust, or like potentially the angels to lust, which we'll get into that conversation. But it begs the question, like, why isn't the head covering prescribed elsewhere? It seems like it's
only
very
when you're
specific.
Preaching or praying or prophesying. It's not when you come to church, you don't all have to wear hats. Like, which is kind of funny. We kind of, even in, head coverings were actually like mandated in the Catholic Church until like 1984 or something like that.
Wow.
It was doubled down on in the 1920s. There was a big kind of push against it during the women's rights movement in the 60s and 70s. But it was always like women wear hats at church, right? So like, especially when you go receive communion. And so Easter hats, that's been a traditional thing. That all comes from this passage. But in this passage, even the most conservative reading would be, women, make sure you're wearing a hat when you go and preach in the services, or when you go and proclaim God's word in the services.
Yeah, but not more generally.
But not just more generally. So it's like, if you look around the congregation, there's going to be aristocracy, there's going to be commoners. They probably just show up as they are, I would assume. But it's like, yeah, you don't have to change your social standing to get up on this platform here. It's kind of cool. And
so we get a little bit more clarity in this covering debate because the passage continues. I stopped mid-passage. We're going to continue verse 5. Context, if she does pray or prophesy uncovered, it says, it is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. We talked a little bit about head coverings, and now Paul is introducing this concept of the head shorn or the head shaved. And he says they're kind of one and the same. So if you're going up there and not covering your head, it's as if your hair was shaved. What is that communicating? What is a head shaved for a woman communicating in the first century? And why would he draw these comparisons?
Yeah, two interpretations. Well, three, and one I've already told you we don't like. So one is something that overlaps with temple prostitutes, which there's no historical evidence for.
Right.
So I'm not going to do
So I'll fill you in with where the theory came from.
Okay,
it comes from Strabo, who's a Greek philosopher. He's in the first century BC. And so this goes back to the Corinthian backstory, because it started off as a Greek colony. It fell, and then it was reestablished as a Roman colony. And we're like in the Roman period. Mm-hmm. And so even the temple prostitute era would have been 100, 150 years ago. And like you were saying, like the connection of head shaved to temple prostitution was interpreters' attempt to connect the two and try to find meaning in this. So I guess we're back to, what does head shaved really mean?
Right, where they're like, well, yeah, maybe, it's just so funny. Just map that onto today, where it's like,
Right.
Do we have any rules about what you're not allowed to wear? Because like that's what the people were 150 years ago. It's like, what? I can't imagine that's the first thing on their mind. So commentators are like, well, it must have been that. I don't think it must have been that, because I think they're the two way more likely interpretations. One, in Roman society, the shaving of a woman's head was connected with like punishment for a crime, and the crime of adultery. And so there's this idea that was a tool of the government that was designed to create shame. And so Paul might be drawing out the fact that, like, man, we think of like just how shame-filled it would be to be someone who's like laid bare before the community, and your hair is gone, and you're like trying to hide yourself because you're so embarrassed. That's not what we want you to feel like when you're, up on the platform here, right? That's maybe that he's saying that's the image I'm getting when I'm imagining, right? If you took your head covering off, I imagine it would feel as vulnerable as being like a Scarlet Letter type woman from, the Puritan book. And that's not where we're trying to go. That's
Right.
one
So
interpretation.
before you go to the second one, I'll say that comes from Tacitus.
Is that also false?
He's a Roman historian. No, it's not.
Okay.
He's commenting on different societies on this specific issue, and he says, neither beauty, youth, nor wealth will find her a husband ever again, as she's shaved and her body is stripped naked. So there's a lot of shame there. It seems like there's also this like forfeiture of what makes a woman in a lot of ways. So that's number one. What's number two?
Yeah, number two, I feel like, there's many ways to look at a passage. Like we're doing the why, how, what on Sunday. I did the what, why, how. And so when you read these verses, the way that I like to read them is almost back to front, right? And so remind us what's the very last thing he says about head shaving?
So it says, it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head.
So he gives this maxim: if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or head shaved, right? And so either that's rhetorical, like obviously it's a disgrace, or it's cultural. You say, hey, in Corinthian culture, we know it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved. Today, I would think, right, if, I don't know, women can have any kind of hairstyles they want. We maybe would say, no, it's not a disgrace anymore, so who cares, right? Or you say, no, I would feel so ashamed if somebody shaved off my hair, right? So it's like, okay, in a world where it's shameful or disgraceful, you'd be so vulnerable, and you'd feel so many negative emotions. In that world, that's a world where I think you should wear head coverings. Because what does he say right before that?
He says, it is the same as having her head shaved. So if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off.
So last thing he says is, okay, if you live in a world where you'd be so ashamed if your hair was shaved by some person who came by and razored your head. Then the thing he says before that is like, okay, well, in that world, I think head coverings is a thing that you should do, because we value women having like this covering, protective, anti-vulnerable covering over their head. And so he's making this reverse natural law argument. And so what he's trying to do, I think, is just kind of appeal to nature, because he talks about nature a lot in this passage, and just say, hey, he doesn't say what it is, and I don't know what it is, but there's something connected in many cultures between women having long hair, and for them, a sign of either femininity and beauty, or a sign of safety, where you'd feel so vulnerable and ashamed if your head was shaved. And maybe it's because of male oppression and cultural stuff and government punishment. Maybe it's because of human nature. But it feels like what Paul's trying to double down on is, the reason I'm making this argument is because I'm trying to help you maintain your dignity in the pulpit. I'm trying to build a rule that's going to allow you to stand with your head high in honor. The last thing I want is for you to feel the way that you might feel if you're one of those women who has this safety covering removed from her in society. And so I'm just saying, there's something to feeling safe in a world that wants to harm you. And I think there's something about our head coverings in our society that's kind of like our hair in our society for women, that is a symbol of protection against vulnerability. And that's why I'm making this rule. He's not trying to dominate women. He's trying to recognize that women can be vulnerable in a male-dominated society in Corinth, or in a mixed society in a church where this is new. And so I just don't want you to feel so vulnerable and ashamed when you stand up and speak for God in this place. I want you to hold your head high and be confident and approach that stage or that platform with dignity and honor as well.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, okay, as we've walked through all of the reasons for covering and hair, I'm wondering, with the head covering on, there's got to be some sense of honor. There's got to be some sense of modesty. There's got to be some sense of femaleness, right? There's got to be some sense of, womanhood, modesty, all these different things. And thinking like, wow, that is not something that women have to fight for when they step on stage. Maybe there's like an element there where it's like, hey, I'm looking for these things. And maybe that's why in the upper class you begin to uncover your head, because you're like searching for the next leg up or upper status. And yet there's something, like you said, I think the word that you keep saying is safety. There's something, a reminder of, you found all those in the gospel. And you find these in the church community, where it is a position where we're not fighting each other. We're not going back to that Genesis 3 warring against each other, man and woman, but we're acknowledging our differences, yet we're coming together and finding that safety together. So all that being said, that's sort of a review of the head covering comments, because we get into a further conversation, which I think could add even more clarity about why these head coverings exist. Talking about glory.
Oh, I love it.
So, with all this being said about head coverings, verse 7 says, "A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God." Which I think, with the conversation about the temple practices of pagan rituals, totally makes sense to me. I think, like, as a man, you kind of cower in fear a lot of times, but like the introduction of just like going out and going for it and speaking for God in this safe place actually really resonates with me. But then we get a little more confusing here. "But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels." We'll get to that last sentence in a little bit.
Let's not all lump all that in one conversation. Let's break them into two.
We will break this into two. Because first, I want to start with the glory piece. And, there's been a lot of attempts to try and connect this, to run away from the separation that it's seemingly presenting. Man is the image and glory of God. Woman is the glory of man. Man didn't come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. This leads me to my skeptic question.
Yeah, here we go, man.
Into this.
This whole podcast could have been skeptics' questions, but okay, here we go.
My skeptic question comes from a female perspective. At least it's going to try to come from.
I was going to say, did you write this question? Yeah, okay.
I did write this question. I am trying to represent all of the women out there watching this and being like, this all feels very weird. This all feels extremely, the word is used, patriarchal. This all feels like two guys just going back and forth, talking about what women should do, how women should act. And then you get to this passage that says women is the glory of man. Woman comes from man. Woman was made for man. And therefore women should have authority over her own head. So it's just like, is that all I'm good for? Like, is that all women are good for in this place? Is for the help of man, for the glory of man, because we come from man? Like, it's like our existence is almost entirely for men. What would you say to that question?
Yeah, I think when we think about glory in a Christian context, we have to recognize that the glory that is emanating from us is glory that is meant to be given to God alone, right? And so when you think of this, it says the man is the image of God and he reflects the glory of God. We think of Moses in the Old Testament, right? Who had this veil over his face when he'd meet with God because he would become like reflecting God's glory out into the world. And then we see, is this Paul? We're talking about unveiled faces. Is 2 Corinthians?
It's 2 Corinthians, yeah.
So then in 2 Corinthians, Paul brings that analogy to the church, and he's talking about men and women. He says, we all, with unveiled faces, reflect the Lord's glory and are being transformed by him with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. And so he says part of the beauty of the Christian faith is that we, as we live in diverse community with one another, we reflect the manifold wisdom of God, the beauty, the faceted beauty and glory of God. It emanates from our body. So if a man in this case stands up in the platform and proclaims God's words to the audience, or a man prays before God, in some way, the divine, he doesn't shrink into nothing and the divine just kind of like pours through him. The divine somehow reflects off of him at the community. And that's a beautiful thing. And that is something that Paul says in 2 Corinthians, we all do together as we reflect the manifold glory of God. And part of the manifold aspect of that is that we do this in different ways. And so, right, when we talk about the husband-wife relationship, we see, right, it's not, hey, men, right, you are the head of your wife, and so do whatever you want. It's like, okay, you've got this natural ability as a man to do whatever you want with this strength, with this, right, whatever it is that you can abuse or you cannot abuse. I want you to imagine the relationship between Jesus Christ and his church, and I want you to use every ounce of strength that you have to lay down your life for your wife. So, okay, that's what your job is. Now, women, we're going to give you a distinct challenge within the body life. We're going to have you reflect another aspect of the beauty and glory of God. Right? We says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And as you look at your husband, don't think, oh, he's in charge of me. He's just does everything. I'm nobody. So no. Think about the fact that God has invited you and given you dignity and honor with his community. And part of your job is to reflect to the world the beauty of the station that we have before God, right? And so husbands, use any power, authority that you have to go and lay down your life for your wife like Jesus did. Wives, give this submissive spirit that God has given you to show the world the relationship between Christ and the church. And when we do these things together, right, we find ourselves in this complex relationship where Paul is very careful not to create a hierarchical relationship between husband and wife, right? So, I mean, look back at these controversial passages, right? So you have wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. It's like, wait, what? It's like, well, hey, let's go back one verse. Right. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, to your own husbands. It doesn't even say the word submit there. It's a interpretation from the verse before. He's saying, you are submitting to one another. Wives, you have that posture towards your husband, but you're submitting to one another. You are interdependent, right? And even here is this idea that that we have an interdependence between woman and man, right? And so he goes on and he says, hey, because man was created first, woman was created from man and for man, and the patriarchal man are like, that's right. And he's like, oh, let me give you one more sentence. and man came from woman, right? And so it's, yes, right? The woman was created from the side of the man, brought to the man as a helper for the man, but man is not primary or more important in that relationship. In the same way that the Spirit is a helper to Jesus and the Father, the woman is a helper. The man literally cannot fulfill the mandate to be fruitful and multiply without the wife. Like, she's not a secretary. She's a co-equal with him. And so he goes and says, and then man comes from woman. Like, let's look at the second generation. First generation, woman comes out of man and comes to help the man. Second generation, like, a man comes out of Eve, two men, right? Cain and Abel. Right. And so this is idea that there's this interdependence between the two. And so Paul is very careful to walk the line of saying, man, it's your job to reflect God's glory by being someone who stewards the natural headship that you have as a man in a way that honors Christ and shows the world what Christ's absolute pouring out of himself for the dignity and good of others looks like. And woman, your job is to show the world how good God is by showing the interdependent relationship between that God has made man and wife co-equals in relationship. And you bring this posture of submission towards your husband, not in a hierarchical way like society does, but in a way where you realize we are inherent in equal and dignity and honor and respect, just like the Trinity, right? But at the same time, this is how I can reflect the manifold glory of God, is by, in this hopefully safe place that is created when my husband lays down his life to create this safe place for our family, I lay down my life back for him again. And so it's a husband and wife in a sense doing the same thing, but doing the same thing in slightly different ways, because we do believe that men and women are different. And I think wrestling through that, I think society has perverted this in so many ways that I understand why so many people are tempted to say men and women are identical. They're the same. Let's stop pretending they're different. But we have to ignore everything in us and everything around us to say that. I think if we can find a safe place like us in the scriptures, us in Christian community, us in this podcast, to start thinking through these things critically, we'll see that actually it's beautiful that men and women are different from one another. And that actually gives us an ability to show the world how the diversity and beauty and interdependence, that the church is the place that has marriages unlike the rest of the world, right? So, and again, this is another place in the passage where you would not imagine how controversial this is. Like talking about women as co-equal with their husband, that's unheard of, right? All the passages in the scriptures around that. So Paul is saying, yes, men and women are different. There's this natural difference. Grace does not abolish human nature. Grace perfects human nature. So let's talk about how to build on human nature, the differences biologically between men and women and naturally between men and women, in a way that brings glory to God and shines his glory out into the world. Let's build on it and perfect human nature. Let's not, and this is mostly speaking to the men, let's not pervert this by subjugating, dominating over women and destroying perverting that which is in nature.
Yeah. So a couple times we've transitioned from talking about men and women to husband and wives. Could you explain that jump really quickly?
Yeah. So, I mean, what's difficult is in the Greek language, oner is the word for man. It means man or husband. Gune is the word for wife. It means wife or woman. Paul's already wrestled in chapter 7 with the fact that, like, man, in the church, I know it's normative in that society. Everyone needs to get married. It's like, you don't need to hustle and get married. Most people probably were, but there were single folks, there were widows, there were people at all these different stations. And so there's some things in this passage, and we'll talk about because of the angels in a second. There are some things in this passage that, like, we don't know exactly how it worked out. Like, I don't know what because of the angels means, but we can talk about it. We don't know what this meant. Like, did single women wear a head covering when they were up there? Or was that just for the married women who already had them with them? Or did single women have them with them too? We don't have a ton of historical research on what about younger women or kids or teenagers.
It's a debate that Tertullian in the 4th century talks about, where he ran into this question. Well, do we allow singles? Like, what should singles do since they don't have the husband? Are we telling them to, like, keep the head covering on, to be submissive to who? So that's a real question that has been wrestled with in church history. So
yeah, and so that's where some of the, I would recommend that we don't, remember the Jurassic Park movie where they got into a bunch of trouble because they filled in the DNA gaps with frog DNA? Like, let's not just guess and invent a temple prostitute narrative. Let's not just guess. And that's what we've tried to do really hard, is let's use the information at hand to make the best theory on what this could look like. Let's hold it with an open hand, knowing that there's a lot of things we do know. There's some things that we don't know. And so, we're not absolutely sure what that would look like. I think that what is clear from the scriptures, and I will say, is that the teachings of the scripture is not, even when we talk about the natural law and the beauty between interdependence in the marriage relationship, Paul is not, and the New Testament teachings, and Jesus does not say that there's an interdependence at the same level between men and women in general in society, right? And so this idea, obviously, men, lay down your life for your friends, so male, female friends, lay down your life for anybody. That's awesome. Like, women and men have a submissive spirit as it comes to other people. That's awesome. Submit to authority, all of us, right? But another way to pervert this teaching would be say that women need to submit to all men, or that every man is the head of every woman, like in that same sense. Like, Paul is trying to show the beauty of a Christian household where a man and a woman come together with distinct personhoods, distinct roles, and distinct functions, where only together can the fruit of that relationship be new life. Where a man and a woman come together, the fruit is childbearing. That is the proof that the Spirit of God is creating something new. Two have become one flesh, and that one flesh is crying when it comes out of the womb. And yet in the same way, it doesn't mean if you're unable to have children that you're not a real married couple, right? But so I think there's this normativeness of, there's something beautiful about the interdependent relationship between husband and wife, that we can apply some of that to the beauty of living in an interdependent Christian community under the authority of the elderships, who are the fathers of the community.
Right.
But at the same time, like, let's not get weird with it and just say, okay, well, the man is the head of the woman, and so, I'm the head of some random woman sitting next to me at church. Like, he's not talking about that at all.
Right. And I think it goes back to the context of praying and prophesying on stage, right? Where there does seem to be a communication that, like, hey, I'm in a position of authority here, happening on stage, and yet I want to retain the symbol of womanhood, of modesty, of all these things that we talked about already. So it is an interesting debate for sure.
And honestly, when you think about the spirit of what we're seeing in this passage, right? So a single guy gets invited to come and pray or preach on a Sunday at church. It's So we could teach them the same thing. Hey, man, when you get up on the stage, like, hold this with reverence, but God has invited you to speak on behalf of himself. So make sure what you're saying is dialed and true, but you can hold up your head with confidence and proclaim the truth. Like, absolutely, right? We could say the same thing to a woman. We can also use the principles from this passage. Say, hey, you're a single woman. You're invited to come and pray. You're invited to come and speak for God in the midst of this worship service. Let me just tell you, like, if there's any place where you feel unsafe or you don't feel vulnerable or you feel like like anything that makes you uncomfortable about any of this, like, let us know, because by no means do we want you to be vulnerable, feeling, right? This whole emotional connection of like your head shaved, like feeling like you're standing there naked in front of all these people. Like it's the last thing I want you to feel. So if there's any way we as a church can support you, or we as the elders can support you to show that you are safe in this place to proclaim the truth, because the elders of the church are behind you, because the men and women of this church, we love you, and so that's, again, say that to men and women. I tell men before they get up and speak, hey, just know these people love you. It's going to be fine, right? People have to get baptized. These folks are for you. They love you. It's going to be fine. But a lot of times, especially with some of the baggage that comes around the male-female relationship in ministry from some of these texts, like 1 Corinthians 14, we'll talk about later. Oftentimes in a church like ours where the men and women really want to honor the Lord, I'll have conversations with women who are invited to pray or invited to preach, and I'll say, hey, am I allowed to do that? The church I was at before, women weren't allowed to do these things. And so it's like, okay, well, I need to make sure that she feels that this is a safe place for her to do this. And me as an elder and you as an elder, we need to ensure that this is a safe place for men and women to come out of the word work and serve the Lord in ministry. So I think part of that is this whole like, yes, husbands, your job is to treat your wife with respect like a porcelain vase. I think it's okay to treat all women with respect like a porcelain vase, right? I think it's good to treat all people with respect. And yet let's not get too granular and crazy in this. Like we can apply the principles of dignity and respect and vulnerability and male and female alike into this passage. And I do think what we learned from nature and from this passage that alludes back to nature is that there's a chance that if I invited a single man to do the first half of the sermon and a single woman to do the second half of the sermon, that they might come to me the week before with two different like feelings about what it's going to feel like for them. And I'm going to have to like coach them in two different ways because of their personality, their background, or even their gender. And so I think Paul just allows us to have a little bit of differentiation where the goal is to give people confidence, safety, and the ability to let God's light shine through them.
So I decided to read the confusing verse in light of this because it says, a man ought not to cover his head at verse 7, but then it echoes in verse 10. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. So a couple things stand out about verse 10 right here, because the ought language, it seems like some people have interpreted as like, yeah, we ought to have authority over our own head and do what we want, as opposed to Paul saying in verse 7, like, this is what ought to happen. This is what ought to happen. And the second odd thing, a man ought not to cover his head versus a woman ought to have authority. So it's like, why didn't he just say cover in that sentence? Like, why did he say have authority? And a lot of people have tried to interpret that. If you look at different translations, it'll say symbol of authority. And so there's something going on about the word authority there, which is why we talked about it early on. Like, what is that authority? That maybe Paul saw a head covering as almost a metaphor for authority. So maybe there's something there. But the question of the day.
Are we going to talk about angels?
The angels.
Before you ask me the angels, let me just say one thing. Yeah. Not because I'm stalling about the angels question, but one of the things that comes up to me as I think about what you just talked about like signs of authority and all that is I'm really thankful that we're having this conversation, because I think there's a lot of good-natured, wonderful Christian leaders in churches have wrestled with these passages, and a lot of times we don't know what to do with it. And so we find ourselves on one of two sides of a spectrum, right? Obviously, there's a big spectrum and there's toxic people on both sides. But in the healthy part of the spectrum, or healthy-ish, there are people who are like, okay, I don't really understand what this means, but I think we should just not let women do stuff in church because it seems too controversial. And I think based on this conversation, it's like, well, Paul definitely was inviting them to come and do stuff at church. So like, let's not do that. We can't punt to that. Right. We got to figure out something in the middle. Other churches are like, okay, all the stuff about headship and glory, like that is so confusing. We know men and women, like Paul says, there's no longer male or female, slave or Greek.
Let's just go roll with it.
We're all the same. Like, we don't need to talk about it too much. Like, and honestly, I talk to pastors around the country, and they usually fall into one of those two camps. They've been to Bible school, they've wrestled with this stuff, but they don't know how to distill it into real life. And so they either just say, well, hey, you know what? Jesus mobilized women, Paul mobilized women, so do we. We don't talk too much about it. Or they say, yeah, there's just some passage in the scripture that prohibit women from doing stuff, so we're just going to err on the side of safety, and so we're not going to do it. And with both of those poles on the spectrum, I'm like, I just feel like you're missing something beautiful.
Yeah, something in the middle. Yeah.
And so, I'm not saying we do it perfectly, but I do think if you want to wrestle with this concept, one of the things that what we're doing right now opens us up to, us as individuals with our own households and us as a church, is to dignify the fact that there is a world where men and women are absolutely equal in dignity, respect, honor. God wants to use them with all the gifts of the Spirit within the body life of a healthy church. And at the same time, men and women are different, like even categorically, where a husband is different than a wife and a man is different than a woman. And when a man and a woman come together in marriage and the fruit is children because of the natural biology of man and woman, that's a beautiful thing. And part of what glory is in philosophy is how do we come alongside what God has made distinctly beautiful in the genders and demonstrate it to the world as the perfection and beauty of God's design. And so I fear for the churches that restrict women from entering into ministry, not only are they being disobedient to some of these scriptures, but I fear that in an attempt to be cautious, they are quenching what the Spirit is trying to do to show the manifold glory of God through the men and women of their church and the gifts of the Spirit as prescribed in 1 Corinthians 11 here. I fear for the churches that make men and women absolutely the same in all things, that they miss the ability to show the beauty of who we are created to be, as what it means to be a godly man, a godly woman. Right? Again, it's a topic we could talk about on a third podcast, but it's really hard to put your finger on. But
right.
I do think that the line that Paul is walking, the reason we're having such a confusing conversation is he's trying to say the church is a place where men and women have inherent dignity, worth, and equality, and they're interdependent on one another like no place in the world. And yet by no means are we going to strip off what makes a woman, what makes a man, because if our church is going to represent the glory of God, our men are going to be the most beautifully strong, masculine men on the planet. And our women are going to be the most beautifully feminine women on the planet. But in order to do that, we have to actually know what are the differences between man and woman, and how do we glorify what God has created in us by glorifying what makes us beautiful. And so all I'm saying in that final thing is that God has created a space for us through this conversation. And for us, even as we wrestle through this individually in our own consciousness and all that, like as a woman, my challenge to you is to lean into biblical femininity and be a strong, beautiful woman who can experience the flourishing of life within the safety of the context of the local church or the safety of your home, or like allow the men that God has placed in your life to create safe spaces for you to flourish and live and thrive in those spaces. And to the men of our church, hey, do not abdicate your responsibility to create safe spaces for women in the church, in the home, for your wife, for your children, and lean into that. Lay down your life to create spaces where men and women can flourish together, because the healthiest description of a church is a church that is governed by a community of these male elders, the fathers of the church, who've created a city where inside the city, it's a place of safety where men and women can come out from the woodwork and live out all the gifts of the Spirit in the body life of the church. And I would think that's a good picture of a household as well. And so I think by leaning into what makes men and women beautiful and glorious, God is calling us to transform into his likeness with ever increasing glory. And I think part of that is related to the gender that God has assigned us.
Man, that's such a cool vision, because I know this has been a big wrestling match for a lot of churches. My follow-up question, what does this have to do with the angels then? If we are working together to get this right, what are the angels' response in the heavenly realms? Pastor Danny, take it away.
I love it. So this is where I want to introduce a new segment to our podcast called the reverse card.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. So, I mean, we can just talk about this for a second.
Sure.
I don't think anyone really knows. Would you disagree with that?
I think there's a lot of theories.
There's a lot of theories. And so, right, disclaimer for podcast listeners, whatever we're about to say feels more like the Corinthian head-shaved prostitutes argument than anything else, because they're all just feel more like speculation, because it's really hard to find any biblical, extra-biblical, historical evidence that connects with the angels.
Yeah.
The one that I have seen, it's going to sound crazy.
Do you want me? Are you playing the reverse card on me?
Well,
you can if you want.
I'll say my thing, and then you tell me if it's crazy.
Okay.
And tell me if this is what you're going to say. It's from the book of Enoch.
Okay.
You talking about this?
Maybe.
All right.
Keep going.
So there's a book that's not in the Bible, but was a book that really informed a lot of Jewish thought in the first century. Right? They call it Second Temple Judaism. That just kind of more of like a historical book, right? We could talk about the Apocrypha some other time, but more of a historical book that talked about different traditions and things that the church understood, right? In the same way that we have commentaries, we got books, spiritual books. We love Grace Awakening by Chuck Swindoll, right? They had Enoch. And one of the things that Enoch talks about is in the book of Enoch, again, not the Bible, in the book of Enoch, there's this description of what happens in Genesis chapter 6, and I might get some of it wrong if you know the story better, because it's not in the Bible. Genesis 6 is, though. So in Genesis 6, we have this story where the sons of God come to earth. They marry the daughters of men. And what the book of Enoch says is that the Jewish people have always believed that what happened in that story was that these angelic beings started entering into relationship with human women, and sin and chaos came into the world. Like this Genesis 6 is where the flood happens. And so God's like, oh my gosh, I got to destroy this whole place after this happened, right? Something went wrong where they had children and it gets crazier, right? Some of the theories in church history is that these children is actually what became demons, and the demons that exist today are actually the children of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Like it's all like mind-blowing stuff. And so some scholars say what the Corinthians would understand Paul to be meaning, if they have a Jewish background and they understand the angelic host through the lens of the Enochian understanding, is that part of the reason that women conduct themselves, feel vulnerable in the world, conduct themselves with modesty in the world, is not just because they feel vulnerable because like, what if some creepy man comes and tries to kidnap me? But there's also a risk, and not to scare anyone, but this is not in the Bible, but there's also a risk that there's angelic beings that want to come and kidnap women and enter into a relationship with them. And what these people say is that what Paul is saying is because of the angels is just a reminder, like, hey, just so you know, part of the reason we're holding on to like men protecting women is because women are not merely needing to be protected from physical forces, but women need to be protected from spiritual forces as well. Not that men can battle, sons of God or whatever, but just, so part of it is like, keep your head down because it's Gotham City out there. I'm not saying I believe that.
Right.
That's the only thing that I've seen. Okay. Well, the only thing that I've seen that lines up with historical understanding of angels and their relationship to the vulnerability of human women that the Corinthians might understand. There's other ways to translate the word angelos. So maybe that's where you're going to go.
Well, I think it goes back to the sexual innuendos going on, because anytime you add sexual connotations to this text, you have to ask yourself, why is it only in the preaching or the prophesying and the praying segment? And so you would think, all right, if angels are on the prowl,
keep your head covered all the time, like never leave your house. Like right. I'm never leaving my house. Yeah.
So you would think Paul would say, actually, the prescription is to keep your head covered everywhere.
And I'm going to say this again. Yeah. I'm not saying I believe this,
but it's out there. Yeah, it's probably been gathered by church history.
So do you have an idea what this means?
Well, I think even to your conversation about just like the beauty and glory of everything, like there's also.
Oh, you're going to give us a real positive one, aren't you?
I am.
Oh man, this is not what I believe.
Cop,
I forgot about that one. This one's great.
So you'll be the bad cop. I'll be the good cop.
Yeah, man, you just took that reverse card and skipped me, went back to you, and won the game.
The good cop answer is that
this is a good answer, guys.
In the church service itself, there are supernatural beings witnessing what's going on. And so you see passages like 1 Timothy 5, I charge you in the sight of God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels to keep these instructions without partiality and to do nothing out of favoritism. So anytime the church is cooperating, like there is an element of supernatural beings in the presence of what's happening. And so that goes back to Ephesians 3, where it says, God's intent was that now through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realm. So maybe there's something significant about getting this right, about seeing men and women flourish together, about the gospel infusion of gendered relationships working out and acknowledging the beauty of being masculine, the beauty of being feminine, and like the angels are craving proper worship. And so maybe there's something there. Angels could simply be messengers, like human messengers. And so later Paul is going to talk about just people traveling to and fro from the church. And if a messenger comes in that has this tradition and then they see it, they're like, what's going on? That's another theory. Another theory is
That's like the most boring theory.
yeah, I know. Another theory is that in 1 Corinthians 6, he talks about humans judging angels. So there might be some element there, but I'm not quite clear about that.
Let me tell you what I like about your good cop theory is that I think of we've gone back to Peter a lot for some reason in this passage. I wonder if there's a link here, but in 1 Peter, Paul's talking about salvation and the beauty of salvation. This is something that angels can't experience. Angels fall from grace. There's no hope for them, right? You go and seduce human women, like in Genesis chapter 6, like you're out of here, right? You're in prison for life. And so it talks about salvation, and then he finishes it in that same manner, and he says, concerning the salvation, he talks about salvation, he says, things into which angels long to look. And the Greek word for long to look is this picture of almost like angels like peering over the outfield fence at like a minor league park where they want to see some like ball players playing or something. And this idea that like, man, angels just want to see what salvation looks like. And I love the idea that one of the things that salvation looks like is the perfection of human nature, where the church is the place that the male-female relationship is done right. And it's like, finally,
that's so cool.
We've got a place where men and women are standing up as men and as women, retaining the thing that makes the glory of the sex, but participating in the liturgy of the church with the fullness of the Spirit of God. And the angels love this stuff. It just feels like that lines up with Peter. And again, we keep going back to Peter, so I wonder if there is some like Petrine thread in this passage in some way.
Such a beautiful vision. And there's just a lot of things going on. And I think I resonate with that one the most, just because we're talking and coming off of this like desire of Paul to see the glory of man and the glory of woman shine brightly. And so verse 11 takes a twist, because I think
we are doing so good.
we're going a little long, but we're going to finish with 3 more questions. You might be thinking in all these conversations, you can kind of see Paul drawing out the differences. And so you might have the person that has been taught this authoritarian position of men taking authority and almost abusing that or using that in a wrong way, or just using that in general. They might stop at verse 10. But 11 seems to be a really key verse, because it says, nevertheless, everything that we talked about, nevertheless, in the Lord, women is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. So it seems like Paul is thinking about what his interlocutor or debater would say back to him at this point, and saying like, hey, don't miss this fact that there seems to be this keyword interdependence that we used on Sunday, interdependence going on. So I want to talk a little bit more about the churches that you were talking about earlier, of trying to wrestle with this. What are the stakes here? You know, what happens if we miss this? And how would you say we as a church are wrestling with this currently?
Yeah, I think the stakes here, it's interesting. We're in this series called Blurred Lines, and we're talking about some of these gray areas. And so this is one of those gray areas that I think a lot of times, especially in biblically conservative churches like ours, is where we want to honor the scriptures, and we're scared of like, man, I don't want to dishonor God by disobeying the scriptures. And in a pretty male-dominated world for most of history, probably in many ways, including today, outside the doors of the church, there's this fear of like, oh, well, you know what? Like, this is a gray area. So let's err on the side of caution, and let's not let women pray or prophesy at all. Right? So women can't preach from the platform. Women can't pray in the service, right? If everyone's, maybe if you grew up in a church where it's like there'd be a Baptist missionary who'd come through, it's like, she's going to share today, right? So you change your language because it feels okay to you, but you don't want to make sure that you're not dishonoring the scriptures, right? And so there's a conservative reading that I talk to many people in our own church who have a conservative reading where it's like, I don't completely understand all of this stuff we're talking about, and so let's err on the side of caution. The problem with that for me is that I totally empathize, have compassion for that position. But the problem with that for me is that we have a opposing thread in the New Testament of the dignity and equality of men and women within the body life of the church. We've got women who are prophesying. We've got in this passage women who are praying and prophesying. We have instructions on when they do it. Here's how to do it properly. We've got women being the first proclaimers of the gospel after the resurrection. We see some of the hallmark of Jesus' ministry be these women. We see, like I said, church planters. And companions and people that Paul writes to and says, don't forget to thank this woman. She's been so helpful for me in my ministry. Right? There are women everywhere. And so I would say, hey, you could build an argument. We need to err on the side of the caution. But how do you know you're supposed to err on the side of caution? On the side of like Jesus is building a trajectory for full inclusion of men and women alike into the body life of the church. Like, why are you erring on the side of the caution anti-women? Why aren't you erring on the side of caution pro-women? Because there's two opposing, it feels, threads. And I think I think those churches that fall to one pole in the spectrum, they're probably trying to honor God.
Yeah.
And they're trying to honor God either by erring on the side of caution towards allowing women to live out the gifts of the Spirit as prescribed in the scriptures, or err on the side of caution by prohibiting women from speaking in alignment with their understanding of the scriptures. And so I would say to folks who are on one side saying, hey, we think men and women are totally equal. Let's stop talking about this. Everyone's exactly the same. So I think there's actually some stakes here. I think you're missing some of the manifold glory of God when you understand the beauty of the distinction between the sexes. Yep. And I honestly think that you might be causing even some harm to some women in your all things being equal church, because you might be shoving them into situations where they are feeling vulnerable, where they are feeling victimized, where it's, I've talked to pastors who lead churches that are they call it egalitarian, where men and women are identical. And they'll tell women things that I feel like are inappropriate to tell women. They'll treat them like it's a locker room. They'll say stuff. I'm not saying the pastors will do it, but they'll have these experiences like, well, we're all the same here, right? And so it's, they shove the woman onto the pulpit, like, go get him, like, be strong, right? Just like you tell like your son or something. It's like, I think you're missing the fact that like her experience in your church might be different than the men's experience in your church. And it's almost like they can't, some of them, right? Some of them, I'm sure do this well, but some of them I've sensed can't treat women with respect and dignity and protect them from these places where they are vulnerable, because they're expecting them to almost live like men historically, where it's like, hey, now we have women in men's spaces. So if you're going to live in this space, you got to act like a man in this space. So I think one of the things that we wrestle with as a church is, hey, we love to see men and women together in all the spaces of our church. But how do we do that in a way that draws out the beauty of both sexes and doesn't say, hey, this is a historically male-led church, but women you're allowed to come to as long as you act like a man, you're good. It's like, we don't say that out loud, but I do think that's a risk when you're trying to build an all people are equal in all ways church, is you're missing some of the things that you should do to serve the women of your church well. And you're also missing a glimpse of the glory of God that comes from the distinction that comes out through these complementary relationships that we see all over the scriptures of what it looks like to bring glory to God as a wife versus a husband is different, or from a female communicator or a male communicator is different, right? And I see that even in our church, right? When some of our female communicators preach, we have people come to us and say, man, the way that Lauren walked through that passage just hit me. Men and women say this in a way that, man, I've never thought about that before. Like her vulnerability or whatever it was, like it just hit me today. And I people, a male communicator comes up, and it's like people are used to male communicators in churches, but it's like, there's a difference, right? And I'm not saying all women preach differently than men or anything like that, right? I have a sociology degree. I know about how all this stuff works, but with biology and all that. But at the same time, I do think if we're going to build something that's beautiful and reflects the glory of God, it's not going to happen by not allowing women to allow things that God commands us to allow them to do. It's also not going to happen by pretending that men and women are just like these gray beings. What's going to be beautiful is when we allow women to be fully women and participate in the church with all the gifts of the Spirit. And when we allow men to be fully men and participate in the church with all the gifts of the Spirit. And that's going to cause conflict. That's going to cause wrestling because men and women process things different, all of that. And that's going to be a dance, right? And so one of the things that we say in our church a lot, we say, we have a church that we want to look like the household of God. We use this same theology we're talking about today to build a structure for our church. And we say, okay, well, this is the idea of elders. Elders are kind of the fathers of the church. So we say the only table at our church reserved for men is the eldership table. And the job of the elders at our church is to kind of protect the boundaries of this community, like a father would do, protect the boundaries of the household, kind of act as the people who, if something needs to be done, if somebody needs to get kicked out, like our elders are going to do that. If somebody needs to be like, hey, you're not welcome here, the elders are going to do that. If someone needs to guard the gate, the elders are going to do that. And if we're in a season of real health as a church, the elders are going to step forward and they're going to have to exert a little more presence because our people are feeling unsafe. But in a safe season in our church where we have doctrinal statements, philosophical statements, we've got policies, we've got practices, we've got a legacy, we've got history, we've got health, we've got a great volunteer team, we've got a great staff ministry team. our elders pretty much just fold into the body life of the church. And what we say is, our vision is that when a church is healthy, what you're going to see, like a Proverbs 31 city, is the men and women of the church are coming out of the woodwork in safety and expressing all the gifts of the Spirit in the body life of the church. And so anytime you see a non-elder doing something, you're likely to see a man or a woman doing that thing, because the elders protect the space, and once it's a safe space, come on out and play. Like, this is a safe place for us to flourish, and the elders delight at participating too, kind of like grandparents, right? It's like, this family's healthy.
And the angels are peeking over the
and
fence.
The angels
like,
are outside
whoa!
the city, and the elders are like, what's up, guys? Just to be clear, the elders can't see the angels. I don't know why I said that. Just because we're at the city gates in Proverbs 31. But I think I think there are stakes from falling off the sides of this precipice. Mm-hmm. But I also think there's an opportunity on the road that we're walking, that the church can look like a place that nowhere else in the world looks like. Because everywhere in the world, it's either a man's world or it's an egalitarian world. There's nowhere else I can think of in the world where it's men are strong men, women are feminine women, and yet they're totally equal and they're thriving together, maybe in a beautiful family. But I can't think of any organizations or entities in the world that are supposed to look like the church. And God says, this is the perfection of human nature. This is the pinnacle of existence, is men and women living in an interdependent relationship in a safe place where men and women alike can flourish under the hand of God and to the glory of God.
Such a beautiful opportunity, picture of an opportunity. That's why I was so excited about this passage. But it seems like Paul begins to land the plane here, because he says in 13, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Going back to the head covering debate that we'd already talked about. Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. So it seems like he's now throwing it back to the audience. Judge for yourself. And he makes an appeal to nature. So we started this conversation trying to figure out what is the principle, what are the principles underneath Paul's tradition here. Now he's appealing to nature. So we get into this conversation about men who have long hair being a disgrace to him, and women having long hair being her glory. So I'm wondering, why do you think Paul lands the plane here with a natural argument about hair again?
I mean, I don't know why. I mean, the thing I was thinking as you were saying that was, Paul has been walking down this natural law line, this idea of like, okay, what would it look like for grace to perfect human nature? Maybe the last point as he's walking through this is like, there might be, he might have his own skeptic question in his brain.
Ooh.
And people are like, well, I actually don't think that is human nature. I don't think men and women are different. I don't think that, I think it's all like, this is all just made up, and I think that you're trying to create this thing out of nothing. And I feel like Paul's like, all right, well, hey, like, let me just give you a thought experiment. If your boss is a man and he comes to work one day with a shaved head, on a scale of 1 to 10, how wow would you be? Like, I don't know, 3? Be like, AJ's got a shaved head. So. All right, if your boss is a woman and she comes to work with a shaved head, how on a scale of 1 to 10, how shocked would you be? Like, oh, geez. And then you're going to try to lie. Be like, oh, I'd be the same. You wouldn't be. He's like, you wouldn't be the same. Like, there's something in nature. Like, it's in secular culture. There's something, I don't know what it is, right? But there's something about, like, hair, right? And the covering over our head that brings safety and vulnerability, right? And so one of the things we talk about when we talk about natural law and gender is that if you jumped into a time machine and you were able to visit any culture throughout the history of the planet, and I don't know how it works, but you get there and you walked out, we had asked the question, well, what do you notice about gender? Because gender, we might say, is a social construct, right? What do you notice? You would notice in every society in the history of humankind that men and women, you can tell the difference between them. And that part of the way that you can tell the difference between them is the way that they glorify the features that society finds valuable. And so, right, you might see like, go down today in LA, you go to Muscle Beach, and you see these men wearing these things that accentuate all their muscles, right? And you see these women dressing like they do in Muscle Beach, right? And you're like, okay, the men and women are different. You're taking notes as a sociologist. Okay, the men are really accentuating these parts of their body. It seems like that's what's valuable to this culture. The women are accentuating these parts of their body, right? I can tell the difference. Where like, if a man jogged by in a female like spandex workout suit, you'd be like, this guy feels like he doesn't fit the mold of everything else I've seen in the society, right? Because that's one of those arguments, right? Like, well, what about the Amazon women? They shave their heads. Or what about like today? We have a lot of people who express their gender in different ways. They're like, I'm going to break the mold. It's like, you notice that where you're like, wow, that person expresses themselves as a female, or identifies themselves as a female, but they dress like a male. That's a disparity, right? We even noticed that today because there are these categories that these people are trying to break and bend, right? And so this is not the time to talk about that, but what natural law would say is like those categories exist in every society. And Paul is trying to say, listen, I know you might say I'm just making up weird stuff. These categories exist in our society, that if for some reason a woman walked into church and her head was shaved, you'd be like, oh my gosh, is she okay? And if a man walked to church with that's bald, be like, oh man, it sucks for you that you're bald. But it's like, that's normal, right? Like men lose their hair naturally. Like part of that is like connected to nature. And so, I have folks always push back on this stuff. They're like, well, what about peacocks? The men are beautiful. Or, what about lions? Like the men have the long hair. It's like, no, absolutely true. But I think that, I don't think he's talking about animals, but I do think that proves his point, is that like even in nature with non-human beings, generally much of the time, there's a distinction between the male and female species. And it's not always that the men are the ones with the short hair and the women with the long hair, but with humans in Corinthian society and in ours, for some reason, men tend to have short hair. You and I both do. Women tend to have longer hair than this. Every woman that I know that's on our staff has longer hair than you and I. Doesn't mean they have to. I don't think he's making a prescription that you got to have long hair to be a woman. I think what he's trying to say is, if you want to push back on this argument fundamentally, tell me why every culture throughout the world has somehow related hairstyle with what it means to be a man or a woman. Like there's something about this, right? And I feel like he just kind of leaves the skeptics with like, well, think about it.
So the passage ends with saying, for long hair is given to her as a covering. And then he lands the plane here. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, which I'm imagining people out there
People probably do.
Man,
they have the lion questions or the peacock questions.
Something we said may have caused contention out there. Paul says we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So a couple of things to land the plane here.
Oh, okay, first of all, I would say on one hand, that's like, wow, that's like a flex. Part of me is just like, I wonder, maybe it is a flex. I also wonder as we're talking about this, if he's like, listen, like I've thought about this a ton. I can't think of any other way to
explain it,
to like walk through this. Like this is what we do because it seems like the best way to deal with all of this, the cards that we've laid on the table.
So then the follow-up question then is, do head coverings still apply today?
Oh, look at that.
Do head coverings still apply today? And because if he's thought a lot about this and this is what's being communicated, is it an argument to bring back head coverings? And if people have disagreements, what should they do?
So head coverings do not still apply today. I can say that. I mean, obviously, we cover our head with hair, like Paul's talking about. And the reason I would say that dogmatically is because when we look at the spirit of this passage and what Paul's trying to do for manhood and womanhood in the church, it's like, I would imagine if I went to our staff and said, hey, for the females on our staff from now on, anytime you come into the platform, I need you to put this bonnet on as a sign of the glory of God in your womanhood. I feel like that would do the exact opposite thing of what Paul is saying. That would feel like subjugation. That would feel shame-filled, almost like the shaving your head analogy. That would feel more vulnerable because people are going to ask, why are you wearing that head cover? Like, it's not part of our culture. And so that's where I feel like when we live out the letter of the law and we miss the spirit of the law, sometimes we do the opposite. We do like violence to the law because what Paul is trying to prescribe is something that brings dignity and freedom. I think I would go to the female communicators and prayer warriors of our church and say, hey, when you step onto the platform to pray on behalf of our church to God or preach the word to the community on behalf of God, I just want to let you know, like, this is a safe place for you to do that. And we're here to support you in anything that we could do to make you feel safe in that place and know that we are behind you and you're not putting yourself out there like on the front lines of battle to get shot at in an inappropriate way. How can we make this an experience where you feel comfortable when you can stand in there with your head high with dignity as a woman and really express who you are as a woman, right? And with any man who wants to come and speak and say, hey, I just want to let you know that when you stand up there, we expect that you're going to preach the word. But when you get up there and preach the word, we expect that of the women as well. But when you get up there and preach the word, we want you to stand up there with confidence. You're welcome to bring your manhood into the that place. Be like, you don't have to be sheepish about it. Like you can speak for God, like with humility and respect, like Christ who emptied himself. But right? I'm more likely to tell a man, go out there, man. We believe in you. Just go. Like, no, I'm not hoping you go, right? Like I would to a son. Where if a daughter's like, I'm scared, I'm like, just get out there. It's like, that feels a little more inappropriate to say to a woman. Like, hey, I'm nervous. Like, hey, I wouldn't say, well, just get out there anyway. I'd say, well, hey, we're behind you. Your community supports you. Obviously, we're not going to push you to do anything you're uncomfortable with. Like, and so it does feel like I'm going to do my best to, in a godly way, treat the men like men and treat the women like women, recognizing, right, we know this, that there is, even within the Christian church, there's more differentiation within each sex than there is categorical difference between the sexes. There are men who are super athletes, strong guys. There are men who are artists. There are women who are the opposite. So it's like, we're not trying to make those kinds of hard and fast rules. But I would say at a core level, we want to set up the men to preach the word with confidence and dignity. And we want to make sure these women are not feeling overly vulnerable and that they're feeling protected, that this is a safe space for them to do ministry. And I think you could totally push back. I mean, you as the audience can totally push back on that. Like, I do believe this is a place where we want to create a safe space for men and women to do ministry. And I think there's more onus on us to protect the space for women because of history, but also because of womanhood. And I think, a guy's going to come up and scream at a male communicator in the face after he preaches. Sure, I'll stand in there, whatever. But like, this guy can go toe to toe with this guy. If a guy comes up and starts screaming in Patty's face, I'm not going to let a guy scream in Patty's face in the front of the church. Like, I'm going to stand in there and be like, you need to stop. You can talk to me, right? Not because Patty doesn't have dignity, but because I'm not expecting Patty to go fight a man after the service. I'm not expecting anyone to fight after the service, but it's just, I just feel like I'm not going to fight against nature where it's like, women are supposed to be honored and protected, and this man is not honoring this woman in God's house. It's like, obviously it's wildly inappropriate to scream at you in front of the sanctuary, me,
Right.
But it's like, I'll let that person take that person on. And so, and obviously that's case by case, but so maybe that's sexist. But I think for us, that's us trying to live in the distinction of, we want men and women to live out their gifts in ministry. We want men to feel the confidence to do that. We want women to have the safety to do that. And we think when they both do that, the results are beautiful.
And I think it's shocking to hear that it's not necessarily something that needs to be like outwardly communicated, because if it was, then it could equally bring that shame and all those things we talked about. So that's an interesting fact. And then some of you out there might be still puzzled about, your use of like going up there and preaching. And so if that's you, be on the lookout for that bonus episode we're going to film. It's going to be great. We're going to talk about the role of women in ministry. We're going to talk further about what that means and what we mean by that. And so,
what do we do? What do we do with the fact that Paul expressly allows these things in this chapter, and then 3 chapters later, he says, I don't allow a woman to speak. It's like, wait, I thought we just talked a long time about how to get them speaking more.
So we're going to have an awesome conversation. I know I say that about every episode because it's awesome, but Pastor Danny, this conversation has been epic in proportion.
And length.
And
we could tell them this is actually hour 3 because we recorded this whole thing twice. We're like, there's so much more we left on the cutting room floor. We got to do this again.
But Pastor Danny, we did it. Thanks for doing this.
We did it. Thanks for listening.